The thin, acrid, almost metallic smell hit me first, sharp and unnervingly out of place, amidst the usual playground scents of cedar wood chips, sun-warmed plastic, and the faint, sweet, nostalgic perfume of the nearby lilac bushes that bordered Harmony Park. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable, unless you were actively looking for something wrong, for something discordant in the familiar olfactory landscape. And that particular Saturday afternoon, a knot of uneasy premonition had already tightened in my stomach. A sixth sense honed by years of dealing with things that could, and often did, go catastrophically wrong. Young Timmy Henderson, a cherubic 7-year-old with a laugh that could melt glaciers, who usually spent hours on the specially adapted swing set, a marvel of inclusive engineering that allowed him to enjoy the exhilarating sensation of flight despite the confines of his wheelchair, had been rushed home in tears by his distraught mother an hour earlier. His usually rosy face had been pale and blotchy, his small hands covered in an angry red rash, complaining of a painful burning itch and a sudden racking, uncontrollable cough that had terrified his mother. Then shortly after, little Maya Patel, a vibrant 5-year-old whose infectious laughter normally echoed from the brightly colored sensory play wall, had started wailing inconsolably, pointing with a trembling finger to angry raised red welts blooming like malevolent flowers on her delicate forearms. My own son, Leo, 6 years old and a perpetual motion machine, a bundle of boundless, uncontainable energy, was thankfully still engrossed in the sandbox at the far end of the Harmony Park playground. This playground, a project our Maplewood Creek Homeowners Association had, after much heated debate, contentious fundraising, and bureaucratic wrangling, finally completed and proudly unveiled last spring. It was designed from its inception to be fully inclusive, a vibrant, welcoming place where children of all abilities, all backgrounds, could play side-by-side learning from each other, forging friendships. It was a significant point of pride for most of us in the Maplewood Creek community. For some, however, a vocal resentful minority, it had clearly been a persistent source of simmering resentment, a symbol of unwelcome change. "Mommy, can I go on the big yellow slide now?" Leo called out, his voice bright and blissfully oblivious to the insidious coiling tension in the air, a tension that only a few of us parents, clustered anxiously near the playground entrance, seemed to acutely feel. He was at that moment a portrait of carefree childhood innocence. "Just a minute, sweetie." I called back my voice, I hoped sounding calmer than I felt. My eyes, however, were not calm. They were scanning the area where Timmy and Maya had been playing just moments before. The brightly colored, specially molded plastic of the adaptive swing set and the intricately textured panels of the sensory wall. The acrid chemical odor was definitely stronger here, catching unpleasantly in the back of my throat, making my eyes water slightly. I saw Sarah Henderson, Timmy's mom, a good friend, returning to the playground, her face a mask of profound anxiety and barely suppressed maternal fury. "The doctor at the urgent care clinic thinks it's some kind of severe allergic reaction," she said, her voice trembling, her hands twisting the strap of her purse. "Or possibly a chemical burn." He asked if Timmy had touched any harsh industrial cleaners or pesticides recently. Her voice cracked on the word pesticides. "Pesticides?" I repeated, a chill colder than the autumn air tracing its icy way down my spine. "Here. At the playground, the HOA is usually very strict, almost obsessively so, about notifying all residents well in advance before any spraying, and they only use pet-safe, child-safe organic compounds. They make a big deal of it in the newsletter." My mind, trained over years of professional experience to assess risk, identify hazards, and connect seemingly disparate pieces of information, was already sifting through a dozen disturbing possibilities. I am by profession the Director of State Safety Inspections for the Department of Labor and Industry. It's a role that encompasses everything from overseeing compliance at massive industrial sites and investigating workplace fatalities to ensuring the safety of public amusement parks and playgrounds. Its core, however, is always the same: protecting people, especially vulnerable populations, from unseen dangers, from negligence, from malice. It's not something I generally advertise to the neighbors. At community gatherings or school functions, I usually just say, I work for the state in regulatory oversight. It's less alarming, less complicated. I often joked with my husband Mark that if people knew what I really did, they'd never invite me to dinner parties, for fear I'd start inspecting their kitchen appliances for code violations. More children were starting to show symptoms. A little girl barely 4 who had been gleefully spinning on the merry-go-round was now crying, hysterically rubbing her swollen, streaming eyes. Another boy, slightly older, who'd been confidently gripping the handrails of the complex climbing structure, was complaining loudly that his hands felt like they were on fire. His palms an angry, inflamed red. Panic, sharp, cold, and contagious, began to ripple through the gathered parents. This wasn't isolated. This wasn't a coincidence. This was spreading. This was an event. Something is terribly wrong with this playground. David Chenmaya Patel's father set his voice tight with a mixture of anger and palpable fear. He was a pediatrician, and his professional concern was evident. Something toxic is making our children sick, very sick. My gaze, drawn by an almost imperceptible movement, fell upon a figure standing slightly apart from the growing knot of anxious parents near the newly planted, still fragile, ornamental cherry trees at the far edge of the playground, Mrs. Agnes Albright. A woman whose meticulously coiffed silver hair and expensive cashmere sweaters were a familiar sight at HOA meetings, where her pronouncements often dripped with a barely concealed disdain for anything that deviated from her exceedingly narrow and frankly exclusionary definition of normal, appropriate, or aesthetically pleasing. She had been by far one of the most vocal, persistent, and venomous opponents of the accessible playground equipment, arguing with a passion that bordered on obsession that it was unnecessarily expensive, visually jarring, attracted too many outsiders from less desirable neighborhoods, and in a particularly vicious and unforgettable comment that still made my blood boil whenever I recalled it, catered to a very small, very demanding minority at the expense of the healthy, normal children who just want a regular playground. She was watching the unfolding chaos, now the distress of the children, the panic of the parents, her expression unreadable, a strange, almost unnerving stillness about her. There was no concern on her face, no alarm, only observation, and something else I couldn't quite decipher. Satisfaction. The inciting incident, the first clear, unambiguous signal of Mrs. Albright's deep-seated, almost pathological animosity towards the inclusive nature of Harmony Park had come a month earlier at the HOA's contentious quarterly meeting. When the board treasurer had presented the final surprisingly modest budget, overrun for the specialized accessible playground features, costs associated primarily with the impact-absorbent wheelchair-friendly surfacing and the wider, gently sloped pathways, Mrs. Albright had risen slowly, majestically to her feet, clutching a sheaf of papers. I must protest yet again, and with the strongest possible conviction. She'd declared, her voice amplified by the community hall's microphone, cutting through the room with the sharp, unpleasant cadence of a guillotine. I protest the exorbitant, unjustifiable sums being lavished upon this highly specialized niche equipment. Maplewood Creek is a community for families, yes, but these features frankly make our beautiful community playground look like a rehabilitation clinic, or worse, a public institution. It's an eyesore. It detracts from the aesthetic harmony we have all worked so hard and paid so much to achieve. And are we absolutely certain these children, these types of children, even appreciate it or benefit from it? Perhaps their unique needs would be better and more appropriately met elsewhere in more specialized segregated facilities. The thinly veiled prejudice, the sheer unadulterated cruelty in her words, had shocked many in the room into a stunned, angry silence. I had countered her. Then my voice deliberately calmed my arguments rooted in legal precedent and ethical principles, calmly outlining the legal and moral obligations for inclusivity under the ADA and the profound, well-documented social and developmental benefits such a playground offered to all children in fostering empathy, understanding, and acceptance of diversity. She had merely sniffed her lips, tightening into a bloodless line, and sat down abruptly, but the venom in her glare, directed squarely at me, had been unmistakable, a silent promise of future conflict. Now seeing her detached, almost clinical observation of the children's acute distress, a horrifying, monstrous suspicion began to form in the deepest recesses of my mind, a suspicion so vile, so unthinkable, that I initially desperately tried to dismiss it as irrational as a product of my own heightened anxiety. Over the next hour, chaos reigned. More parents arrived, heard the terrifying news, and quickly frantically removed their children from the playground. The distant, mournful wail of sirens grew closer as some parents, understandably terrified and unwilling to wait for answers, called for ambulances directly. The Harmony Park playground, usually so vibrant with children's laughter, with the joyful sounds of active play, emptied rapidly, leaving behind a scattering of abandoned bright red buckets, forgotten plastic shovels, a lone forlorn teddy bear, and an almost palpable, suffocating aura of fear and suspicion. Mr. Henderson, the flustered, well-meaning but ultimately ineffectual HOA president, arrived wringing his hands, his face pale, assuring everyone in a shaky voice that they would get to the bottom of this, that all necessary steps would be taken. He looked utterly overwhelmed. I walked over to the adaptive swing, the apparent epicenter of that faint, persistent, acrid smell. Crouching down, careful not to disturb any potential evidence, I examined the brightly colored, specially molded plastic seat. There was a faint, almost invisible oily residue on its surface. I touched it cautiously with a gloved finger. I always, as a matter of professional habit, carried a small emergency preparedness kit with disposable gloves, antiseptic wipes, and a miniature first aid kit in my oversized mom bag. Leo sometimes teased me about it, asking if I was inspecting his sandcastles when I put on my gloves before joining him in the sandbox. The chemical smell was definitely stronger, more concentrated on the residue itself. It wasn't any commercially available cleaning agent I recognized, and it certainly wasn't anything that should ever be on playground equipment accessible to children. My internal alarm bells were now screaming. The rising action of this unfolding public health disaster accelerated with terrifying speed. By that evening, nearly a dozen children ranging in age from 3 to 10 had been treated at local urgent care clinics or the Oak Haven General Hospital emergency room for a bewildering array of symptoms: severe blistering skin irritation, acute respiratory distress, persistent nausea and vomiting, and in a few cases, alarming neurological signs like dizziness and temporary blurred vision. The doctors were initially baffled, suspecting a rare aggressive form of contact dermatitis, or perhaps exposure to an unusually potent airborne allergen. But the clear pattern that quickly emerged, children who had direct prolonged contact with specific pieces of the adaptive playground equipment being the most severely affected, pointed unequivocally to something localized, something physically present on the playground itself, something that had been deliberately applied. The HOA board, facing a torrent of angry, frightened calls and social media outrage, called an emergency community meeting for the following evening. In the meantime, they officially closed the Harmony Park playground, cordoning it off with ominous yellow, "Caution, do not enter" tape that fluttered like mournful prayer flags in the evening breeze. Whispers, rumors, and increasingly wild accusations flew through the Maplewood Creek community. Had the playground equipment manufacturer used faulty, toxic materials? Was it a horrifically botched cleaning job by the HOA's newly contracted low-bid maintenance crew, or was it something far more sinister? Mrs. Albright, I learned from a distraught neighbor, who forwarded me, screenshots had been disturbingly, almost ghoulishly vocal in the community Facebook group, not expressing concern or sympathy for the affected children and their families, but rather with a chilling detachment, suggesting that the new, overly complicated and experimental accessible equipment was inherently unsafe, perhaps even toxic in its design. Perhaps, she'd written in a widely circulated post, this unfortunate incident is a clear sign that we should stick to simpler, more traditional, time-tested playground designs. These newfangled, expensive contraptions for children with special needs are clearly more trouble and more liability than they're worth. Maybe the children who use them are simply more delicate, more prone to reactions. Her breathtaking cruelty, her insidious attempt to blame the victims, to blame the very equipment designed to enhance their lives, was almost beyond comprehension. This wasn't just callousness. This felt like a deliberate, calculated campaign to discredit the inclusive playground, to achieve by other more nefarious means what she had failed to achieve through legitimate HOA channels. She was subtly, poisonously pushing her original agenda, get rid of the accessible equipment, return the park, to her narrow vision of normalcy. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind reeled. The image of those children's innocent faces contorted in pain and fear haunted my waking hours and my fitful, nightmare-ridden attempts at sleep. The oily, viscous residue on the swing, the sharp, acrid smell Mrs. Albright's strange, detached calm at the playground, followed by her subsequent malicious victim-blaming comments online, it all coalesced with horrifying clarity into a deeply disturbing, almost unthinkable hypothesis. My professional training, the part of my brain that analyzed chemical data sheets, safety protocols, and human behavior in situations of extreme stress or malice, was screaming at me, insisting that this was no accident. This was intentional. This was a targeted attack. The next morning, after a sleepless night spent pacing my living room, I made a decision. A hard decision, but a necessary one. I would not wait for the slow, ponderous turning of bureaucratic wheels for the HOA to commission their own, likely inadequate, poorly managed, and potentially biased investigation. The children of my community were at risk. The evidence, if it was what I suspected it to be, could degrade, could be washed away by rain, could be deliberately tampered with. I picked up my secure work phone and called my deputy director, Mark Jenkins, a man I trusted implicitly. "Mark," I said, my voice low, urgent, and devoid of its usual professional warmth. "I need a full hazmat-certified environmental inspection team at Harmony Park in the Maplewood Creek subdivision. Priority 1, highest possible urgency. And Mark, I need it discreetly, very discreetly. I want them on site an hour before the scheduled HOA emergency meeting tonight. I'll meet them there personally. I have a strong, deeply disturbing feeling we're dealing with a deliberate chemical contamination, possibly a criminal act." There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line. "Maplewood Creek." Mark finally said, his voice tinged with surprise and concern. "Sarah, isn't that near where you live?" "It's where I live, Mark," I replied grimly, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "And my son Leo plays on that playground almost every single day. Just get the team here. And Mark, no sirens, no marked vehicles until I give the word. I want to see who shows up before the meeting." I had a hunch Mrs. Albright might arrive early, perhaps to survey her handiwork, perhaps to plant some misleading counter-evidence. This was the pivotal moment, the irreversible turning point. I was no longer just Sarah Sharma, concerned Maplewood Creek parent. I was activating the full, formidable authority of my office, the Director of State Safety Inspections. The game, as they say, had just changed, profoundly. That evening, precisely an hour before the emergency HOA meeting was due to commence in the community clubhouse, 2 unmarked plain white vans pulled up quietly to the service entrance of Harmony Park. My team, 3 of my best environmental chemists, and 2 specialized hazmat technicians, all clad in plain clothes, but carrying sophisticated state-of-the-art detection equipment in unassuming black duffel bags, fanned out quickly, silently across the deserted, eerily silent playground under my direct on-site command. I led them straight to the adaptive swing set and the textured sensory wall, the areas where Timmy and Maya had been most affected. Their handheld photoionization detectors and portable chemical sniffers began to chirp, then wail almost immediately. Director Dr. Eris Thorne. My lead chemist, a brilliant, unflappable scientist, said, his usually jovial face grim as he looked at the rapidly scrolling readings on his device. "We're getting strong, definitive positives for a highly concentrated organophosphate compound, specifically something closely related to commercial-grade agricultural pesticides, but with an unusual, highly corrosive additive, almost like a caustic stripping agent. This isn't something you'd find in a home garden shed, Sarah, and it's absolutely, unequivocally not rated for use anywhere near children or on playground equipment. Direct skin contact, especially prolonged, would cause severe chemical burns and blistering. Inhalation of the fumes even worse, leading to respiratory distress, neurological damage." His voice trailed off the implications, clear, horrific. My blood ran cold. Organophosphates, nerve agents, essentially, highly toxic, difficult to obtain legally without a commercial license. And deliberately applied it, seen from the localized readings to the very pieces of equipment used most often, most intimately, by children with disabilities. Children who often had more prolonged direct physical contact with surfaces, children whose immune systems or skin integrity might already be compromised due to existing medical conditions. This was beyond negligence. This was beyond reckless endangerment. This was a calculated, targeted, monstrous attack. Just as the team was carefully, meticulously taking surface wipe samples, swabbing the contaminated equipment, and bagging them in sealed, labeled evidence containers, I saw her, Mrs. Agnes Albright, approaching the playground from the direction of her home, which backed onto the park. She was early for the HOA meeting, a thick manila folder clutched tightly in her hand, a look of grim, righteous purpose etched on her face. She stopped dead in her tracks when she saw us, her eyes widening in surprise, then narrowing in suspicion, as she took in the team, the sophisticated equipment, my presence. I was wearing a simple jacket, but I deliberately clipped my official state ID badge to the lapel. It was prominent, unmistakable. What is the meaning of this? She stammered, her carefully cultivated composure faltering for the first time. Who are you people? What are you doing on HOA property after hours? This playground is closed. I stepped forward, my expression unreadable, my voice cold, even, and utterly official. We're from the State Department of Safety Inspections, ma'am, I said, and I am Director Sharma. We are currently conducting an emergency unannounced safety audit and environmental hazard assessment of this public playground due to multiple credible reports of chemical exposure and serious injuries to children. I held up my badge, letting the official gold seal catch the fading light. This is now an active state investigation scene. Her face paled dramatically. The manila folder, a prop perhaps for her planned performance at the HOA meeting, slipped from her suddenly nerveless fingers, its contents, what looked like printed complaints and photographs, spilling unheeded onto the grass. State, safety, inspections. She whispered the words, barely audible, her eyes fixed on my badge as if it were a venomous snake. She had absolutely no idea who I was, what power I wielded, in situations exactly like this. Her carefully constructed world of petty HOA tyranny, of neighborhood power plays and prejudiced vendettas, was colliding head-on with the full, unyielding force of state regulatory authority. And she was on the wrong side of that collision. Her composure, though severely rattled, didn't entirely desert her. This is an overreaction, she sputtered, trying to regain some semblance of control. A few children had minor rashes, probably from allergies or poor hygiene. There's no need for this theatrical display. You have no right to be here without HOA board approval. She glanced nervously at the hazmat team, who were continuing their work with focused intensity, ignoring her. Are you trying to imply that the HOA is somehow responsible for common childhood ailments? Mrs. Albright, I said, my voice like ice. We are investigating the presence of highly toxic, illegally applied chemical agents on this playground equipment. Agents that have caused significant documented harm to multiple children. My team has already confirmed the presence of dangerous organophosphates. This is far beyond minor rashes or poor hygiene. This is a public health emergency and potentially a criminal matter. And as Director of State Safety Inspections, I have not only the right, but the statutory obligation to investigate any credible threat to public safety, especially where children are involved on any property within the state, with or without HOA board approval. Perhaps, I added, my gaze unwavering, you'd care to explain what you were doing near this playground late Tuesday evening, Mrs. Albright. A witness reported seeing a woman matching your description carrying a garden sprayer in this vicinity after dark. This was a calculated bluff based on a vague comment from a neighbor, but I watched her reaction intently. She blanched again, her eyes darting around as if seeking an escape route. I was merely inspecting the new plantings, ensuring they were being properly maintained. That sprayer, it contained organic deer repellent to protect the cherry trees. Her explanation was too quick, too defensive. The climax arrived swiftly, brutally at the emergency HOA meeting a short while later. The clubhouse was packed to overflowing with furious, frightened, and bewildered parents. I didn't begin my address as Sarah Sharma, concerned Maplewood Creek resident. I stood before them as Director Sarah Sharma, State Department of Safety Inspections. I laid out with cold, irrefutable scientific precision the preliminary findings of my team, the confirmed presence of a highly toxic, illegally applied chemical agent, an organophosphate pesticide mixed with a caustic accelerant, on specific pieces of playground equipment. I detailed the known health effects of such compounds. A wave of horrified gasps, then angry, incredulous murmurs swept through the room. The children's faces, pale and tear-streaked, looked up at me from their parents' laps. This was not an accident. I stated, my voice ringing with an authority that commanded absolute attention. This was not a case of negligent maintenance. This was a deliberate, targeted act of chemical contamination, an act that has endangered the health, the safety, and the well-being of multiple children in this community. My eyes found Mrs. Albright, who was sitting rigidly in her chair at the board table, her face a mask of forced composure, though a tiny muscle twitched uncontrollably near her left eye. The State Police Major Crimes Unit and the Regional Office of the Environmental Protection Agency have been fully briefed and are now partners in this ongoing investigation. A full criminal inquiry is underway. Just at that moment, as if on cue, 2 uniformed state police troopers entered the packed clubhouse, their presence instantly ratcheting up the tension. They were accompanied by a stern-faced detective in plain clothes. They moved purposefully, without hesitation, towards the HOA board table, towards Mrs. Agnes Albright. Agnes Albright. The detective said, his voice calm but utterly firm, his gaze unwavering. We have a judicially authorized warrant to search your residence and your vehicles, and we need you to come with us to the county barracks to answer some questions regarding the deliberate chemical contamination at the Harmony Park playground. Mrs. Albright looked as though she had been physically struck. This is a mistake, an outrageous slander. I had absolutely nothing to do with this. I am a respected member of this community, a volunteer. You can't possibly, she protested, her voice rising to a shrill, desperate shriek. Her expensive lawyer, hired hastily that afternoon, tried to intervene, but the detective simply held up a hand, silencing him. Ma'am. The detective continued, his tone unyielding. A reliable neighbor whose security camera covers a portion of your backyard and the access path to the park provided us with footage from late Tuesday evening. It shows an individual matching your description, wearing dark clothing and carrying a garden sprayer and a dark container, exiting your property and heading towards the playground. The same footage shows that individual returning approximately 45 minutes later, no longer carrying the container. Furthermore, during a preliminary consensual look around your garden, shed earlier this afternoon, conducted with your husband's permission, after the initial chemical identification by Director Sharma's team, we found residue of the specific organophosphate compound and the caustic additive in that very sprayer, as well as several recently purchased, nearly empty containers of the precursor chemicals hidden beneath a stack of old newspapers. Receipts for the purchase of these industrial-grade pesticides and other chemicals dating from last week were found in your kitchen drawer. Her face crumpled. The fight, the arrogance, the self-righteous indignation, all drained out of her, leaving behind a hollow, terrified shell. The full, horrifying, inescapable truth of her actions, her calculated, targeted malice, hung heavy poisonous in the suddenly silent room. She had deliberately, systematically poisoned the playground, specifically targeting the adaptive equipment used most often by disabled children because she saw them, their needs, their very presence, as an intolerable affront to her twisted, prejudiced sensibilities, a blight on her vision of a perfect, homogeneous, exclusive suburban landscape. She had tried to silence their laughter, to erase their joy with poison. Her lawyer, seeing the irrefutable evidence and the grim determination on the faces of the law enforcement officers, wisely advised her to remain silent. Mrs. Albright, no longer the imperious community leader, but a pale, trembling, defeated woman, was escorted from the room by the state police. The sound of her muffled sobs was the only sound that broke the stunned silence. The following action, the legal and communal reckoning, was swift and decisive. The evidence against Mrs. Agnes Albright was overwhelming, damning. The chemical analysis, the security footage, the receipts, the witness statements, it all painted an undeniable picture of premeditated malicious intent. Faced with irrefutable proof and the prospect of a very long prison sentence, she was charged with multiple felonies, including aggravated assault with a chemical agent, multiple counts of reckless endangerment of children and illegal use and disposal of hazardous materials. The state also vigorously pursued and secured hate crime enhancements due to the clearly targeted nature of her attack on disabled children and the equipment specifically designed for their use. The Maplewood Creek community was in shock. then profound outrage, then slowly, painstakingly began to heal. This was no longer just a collection of houses and manicured lawns. It was a community forged and bound by a shared trauma, a shared sense of violation, and a renewed, fierce commitment to protecting its most vulnerable members. Volunteers supervised by my department and EPA specialists organized to thoroughly, meticulously decontaminate the Harmony Park playground. Every grain of sand, every wood chip, every surface was tested, cleaned, or replaced. When it finally reopened months later, it was with a renewed sense of vigilance, a deeper appreciation for its inclusive purpose, and a palpable sense of community triumph over malice. Mrs. Albright was convicted on all counts in a trial that drew statewide attention. The judge, visibly appalled by the calculated, cold-blooded cruelty of her crime, her utter lack of remorse, handed down a lengthy prison sentence and ordered her to pay substantial restitution and fines. Her considerable assets were seized to cover the significant medical expenses of the affected children, the extensive costs of the playground remediation, and to fund a new statewide educational program on disability awareness and hate crime prevention. Her reign of petty tyranny was over her life in ruins. The Harmony Park incident, as it became known, served as a powerful, tragic catalyst for sweeping statewide changes in public safety regulations. My department, the State Department of Safety Inspections, spearheaded these reforms. We implemented mandatory, rigorous, unannounced safety audits for all HOA-managed and community playgrounds with specific detailed protocols for detecting and preventing malicious tampering, chemical misuse, and environmental hazards. We developed new comprehensive guidelines for the safe installation, maintenance, and regular inspection of accessible play equipment, ensuring that inclusivity did not come at the expense of safety, but rather actively enhanced it by requiring higher standards for all. Mandatory training programs for HOA boards, property managers, and maintenance personnel on their legal and ethical responsibilities regarding public safety, environmental protection, and disability rights were rolled out across the state. The Harmony Park protocols became the new gold standard. The children, the brave, resilient children of Maplewood Creek, recovered, though some bore the emotional scars of the experience for a long time, and a few had lingering physical sensitivities that required ongoing medical care. But they also witnessed firsthand the power of a community standing up for them, of justice, however delayed, ultimately being served. Leo, my precious. Leo asked me one day, his small hand in mine, as we walked past the newly reopened vibrant playground. "Mommy, did you catch the bad lady? Because you're like a superhero for safety, like in my cartoons." I hugged him tight, my heart swelling with a fierce protective love. "Something like that, sweetie," I whispered. Sometimes, even in quiet, peaceful neighborhoods, we need people, everyday people, to look out for the unseen dangers, to speak up against injustice, and to make sure everyone, especially the children, is safe and protected. Harmony Park was never quite the same after the poisoning. It was better. It was stronger. The laughter of children, all children from every walk of life, with every kind of ability, echoed there, once more louder and more joyful than ever, a vibrant, defiant testament to resilience, to the enduring, unbreakable strength of community, and to the unwavering fundamental principle that every child, regardless of ability, background, or circumstance, deserves a safe, welcoming, joyful place to play, to learn, to grow, and to simply wonderfully be a child. The thin, acrid smell of poison had been replaced forever by the rich scent of fresh cedar mulch, the sweet perfume of newly planted resilient flowers, and the undeniable, unquenchable fragrance of justice, served, and of hope, fragile but tenacious, reborn.